Hi everyone, or kia ora, since we are currently both in New Zealand. I'm Riccardo, the host of this podcast, and today I'm glad and honored to have Dr. Eric Helms here. So,
Thank you so much
if
for
you
having me.
wanna, yep.
No, I appreciate that.
And Eric, I take this opportunity just to ask you if you can introduce yourself. Could you walk us through your specifically academic background and how you became an involved in PhD supervision?
Sure. Yeah. So I started out as a lifter and then I became a personal trainer and I became very interested also in the science of not just personal training, but more specifically strength and physique sports science. Because I transitioned from being a trainer to eventually being a strength and physique coach, from being an in-person personal trainer. So for me, this started as an interest in improving our applied research so that we could make better decisions as practitioners, athletes, and coaches. So I started doing a bachelor's degree in one of the early online programs through CalU, which is a university in Pennsylvania. It has a strong athletic training program, and they were one of the first to develop a robust online program. And you specifically had to be working in the fitness industry a certain number of hours to do it, and you needed to have a certain in the United States. The academic system, which we'll talk about, is a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
Our bachelor's degrees are typically 4 years rather than 3, which is common in many European countries as well as Australia.
Also in Italy.
Yeah, and part of the reason for that is the first 2 years are very similar no matter what your major is. So they give you a general education background to make sure that you're kind of all on the same page. Because high school education is very disparate in terms of quality in the US. So you will have some people who don't necessarily have the capability to be successful in a university setting. So they do the first 2 years as your general ed requirements. So anyway, this program, the bachelor's program, it had 2 requirements. You had to have the equivalent of the first 2 years done, which is sometimes called an associate's degree. And you needed to be working in the fitness industry a certain number of hours, and then you could write a cover letter and you could start the program and transfer into it. So when I was still in Sacramento, California, I did this while I was still working as a personal trainer. I really loved it. I liked the self-paced nature, and I then went on to do their master's degree program, which had similar requirements, very practitioner-focused. It was in alignment with the National Academy of Sports Medicine, which is a large certifying body for personal trainers in the US and also now more internationally as it's grown. And I finished that in early 2012. And as I was getting to the end of that degree, I thought, you know what? I really want to get involved in actually conducting research. Another interesting difference in the US versus a lot of other parts of the world is that there are many master's degrees that don't have a thesis component or a dissertation. They just have courses, so they're coursework only. They might have an exam or a final project. And mine did. I had like an annotated bibliography that I wrote about protein intake, which got me interested in the topic. And in New Zealand, Australia, the UK, to get into a PhD program, you need to have a bachelor's with an honors dissertation, or you need to have a master's degree that has a thesis component in most cases. Or the PhD might have a built-in master's phase or something like that. It does vary widely from school to school, but it's much more common in the US to have a master's degree with no thesis. So through my coursework, master's and bachelor's, I built the confidence of going, you know what, I actually do want to not just learn to interpret research, but also conduct it and actually add to the knowledge base. And this is where I realized through some consultation with colleagues I had in academia at that time, we were both teaching at the same personal training institute, that I didn't have to be bound to the US. Again, in 2012, the growth of the fitness industry and just online education and the pathways of sports science and sport nutrition in the US were less developed. So I was looking at local schools like UC Davis, as well as Sacramento State University, and their PhD programs were not a good fit. It would have either been very mechanistic, like Keith Barr does great work out there looking at actual cell cultures and exposing it to collagen and things like that. Very cool muscle physiology, but not applied. And then a lot of the work at Sacramento State for a PhD was a little more clinically focused, so kind of more in the realm of physical therapy. And there wasn't a lot of researchers in the area of what I was interested in, because I wanted to get into sports nutrition and strength and conditioning. So I was recommended to look online because I had a successful online business. I had transitioned successfully at this point from being an in-person personal trainer to making the majority of my income teaching, as well as having an online roster at 3D Muscle Journey. And I had a conversation with my wife, Barbara. We were on a walk, and I said, what do you think about me trying to get into one of the local schools here and just us staying in the same house, or packing up everything, taking our cats and moving down to Aotearoa and going to school in New Zealand? And she was immediately like, let's go to New Zealand. Yeah. Because I had reached out to a number of schools after realizing I wasn't bound geographically. I reached out to Loughborough. I reached out to Edith Cowan University in Western Australia. And I also reached out to AUT through a mutual contact. And I had a really great experience.
The most, if you want to say it, the most important in the world, or at least famous about research. You mentioned Loughborough, Springs here.
Yeah, Springs had a good reputation at that time, but I would say it was not quite as well known as Edith Cowan University at that time. They were becoming relatively well known in the U.S. because they had a master's degree you could do mostly online, but you'd come out for a few practicals that were focused on strength conditioning in partnership with the NSCA. So I was aware of that because I had a CSCS. I'd been an NSCA certified for a year or two at that time. Yeah. And in the U.S., you pretty much have to have a NSCA CSCS certification, Certified Strength Conditioning Specialist, to work in the S&C world. So I think a lot of people were considering Edith Cowan, but their online master's degree program didn't really have that robust of a thesis. It would have been like studying online, going there for a couple weeks, and perhaps doing something like a narrative review or systematic review for the thesis. And I wanted to do hands-on research, so I didn't want that program. I did have a brief email exchange with Dr. Greg Half about coming out there. But when I had a Skype call with John Cronin, who at the time was the director of Springs and ended up being, he's a well-known professor, has mentored many and done a lot of work in the field of strength conditioning. He was very enthusiastic about getting me out there. And what I had to do, though, because I had that coursework-based master's, was to do what's called a Master's of Philosophy, an MPhil. Sometimes you will see a Master's of Research or an MRes, and they're all quite similar. They typically are open to people who have the coursework equivalent of a master's. You'll find them in the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, and other parts of Europe. And they are just a thesis. So there's no coursework at all. And by completing them, it gets you entrance into a PhD. When it's not foreign students doing them, another common type of student who does it is people who work in more clinical worlds. So they might have a clinical master's or equivalent, or what's called a postgraduate diploma, which is pretty common in Australia, the UK, and New Zealand.
Yeah, this thing is something that honestly I never heard before coming here, because for example in Italy we don't have it. In Italy we have the common structure about a typical bachelor degree, 3 years. After that, a master degree, so other 2 years. And after that, you can get involved in a PhD maybe.
Yeah. And some of these, and it's actually similar, that's actually more similar to the US. But the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and some other Western European countries, they have the equivalents of these. And I wasn't familiar with it either as an American. And I had a very funny conversation with John. So, if you say you have a bachelor's with honors in the US, honors just relates to how well your GPA was, what your grades were. So,
because this is another thing that is different. I discovered also that here, the GPA, because in Italy we don't have that kind of metrics. We had, a score that is the max is 110. Maybe you can get laude. Probably is, I don't know, is that maybe the honor that you are mentioning?
Yeah,
I don't know.
exactly. So you can get laude, cum laude, magna cum laude, summa cum laude in the traditional university system that just kind of ranks like how well you did in your program. So and every because I've had a lot of international students from all over the world. So every country has some version of this. So the grade point average GPA scale in the US goes to 4. In Australia and New Zealand, I think it goes to 9. The UK is different, and every country is a little different. And when you apply to a international school that is different than your home country, they have a specific team and department in the postgraduate research school who specifically assesses and figures out the equivalent of where you're at to see if you're eligible for the program, and then also if you're eligible for certain scholarships or what have you. So anyway, in the States, if you are getting a high 3 point something GPA, it's typically said that you have a bachelor's degree with some degree of honors. So my bachelor's was like a 3.83 GPA, so I had honors. And John, because he's from New Zealand, for him, a bachelor's with honors means that you did a honors year or an honors dissertation. And an honors year that you tack on to the end of a bachelor's degree is considered a postgraduate qualification equivalent to a master's. And in the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, if you do an honors dissertation, which is typically reserved for people who did very well in their coursework during their bachelor's, it's a shortened or close to the same length thesis as a master's, again reserved for high performing students typically. And once you finish that, then you can go straight to a PhD. So when he asked me, because he was trying to save me money, because in New Zealand, the PhD is subsidized by the government. It's far cheaper than a master's degree. So for an international student who does a master's degree, it's quite expensive. So when he heard that I would, because I had a master's by coursework only, I would need to do the MPhil, which is what I ended up doing. He was like, "Oh, let's figure out if we can just get you right into the PhD." She's like, "Oh, Eric, do you have a bachelor's with honors?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And he goes, "Great. What was your dissertation on?" I was like, "Oh, I didn't do a dissertation." He goes, "But
Or is
but
it
what
possible?
but what was your honors on?" And I was like, "I had a 4.0. I had a 3.83 GPA." And he was like, "I don't care about your GPA, but tell me about your honors here." And I was like, "What do you mean?" So we had this miscommunication until I clarified that, and that was one of the first times I realized, okay, this is very different. But then the
Yeah.
next conversation we had was also confusing because there are no degrees that are research only in the States. That's not a thing. If you do a PhD, you'll typically hear it takes 5 years or longer. And you sometimes will hear all but dissertation, or I'm ABD. So there's two different things from the States to Europe and Australia and New Zealand. Is one, we do a dissertation in our PhD, and we do a thesis in our master's. And a dissertation is longer in the States, while a thesis is shorter. Everywhere else in the world, it's the opposite. A dissertation is considered the shorter version of a thesis, and a thesis is longer. So that's one minor thing that's easy to navigate. But the confusing thing is that in a PhD in the States, you're doing approximately 2 years of coursework and working on your proposal, and then you do your proposal and you become a PhD candidate. And it's seen as almost like not necessarily the hardest part of your PhD, depending upon what type of research you're doing. It absolutely can be, but 2 years of courses, a proposal, and exams, comprehensive exams, typically conclude the first 2 years. And that is done in other countries as well, but it's the only way it's done in the States. However, if you do a PhD in the UK, Australia, or New Zealand, to get into the program, you have to have research experience, high GPA, a master's equivalent, whether that's an honors year or an actual master's. And then you start at the point of just doing research. And typically your first year is when you do your proposal, and then the rest of your experience is just research. So you have no coursework. And here's the confusing part. In New Zealand, they use the terminology courses, classes, or papers. They'll say, "Oh, you take these papers." In the US, papers does not mean classes or courses. It means like an actual paper that you've written, like an essay.
Yeah, I was thinking the same.
Yeah. So as an American, I'm not used to a master's degree or a PhD not having classes. And JC, John Cronin, had explained to me the PhD will only be research. I'm like, okay, cool. And I knew that I needed a research component to get into it. So we were talking about the Masters of Philosophy after we'd gotten over the confusing statement about a bachelor's with honors. I'm like, okay, cool. Now I can't get directly in, so I need to do the MPhil. And I was like, so what classes do I have to take in the Masters of Philosophy? And he says, Eric, there's no papers. I was like, okay, cool. So I won't have to write any papers, but what classes do I have? And he's like, no, there's no papers. And I'm like, I got it, JC. What is there? Is there written tests? Is there oral exams? And eventually we got to the point where he was like, no, there's no classes. Like, oh, so when you say papers, what do you mean? So these distinctions between regions can be sometimes quite confusing. You're converting GPA, you're using different terminology for a thesis versus dissertation, classes versus papers, and certain degrees just simply don't exist. I had never heard of a graduate diploma, a graduate certificate, or a postgraduate certificate, or a postgraduate diploma. Those are not things in the US. We have an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree,
Yeah.
a master's degree, and a PhD. And if you get a certificate or a diploma, they are typically not considered equivalent to any of those, but are almost just things on the side. Sometimes you can get them to get certain professional or clinical jobs in addition to your bachelor's or master's. And there's obviously exceptions to all these rules. The U.S. is a big place with thousands of universities, but that's kind of the common language in the common system. And another really rough thing about the U.S. is that it's extremely annoying that most universities are not good at recognizing prior credit. You can have I have exercise science as a class, and there's an exercise physiology equivalent at this school I'm going to, and they taught the same things, but now we have this handbook that says they don't transfer, so no credit. You have to retake the class. While
Yeah, so
other smaller countries or more, I would say, forward-thinking universities, they will actually assess on a case-by-case basis and assess the coursework. Show me the transcript of your class, and I'll see what it counts as, and have an actual team that evaluates it. Now, some of that is just that the universities are, and you can see this in the States right now, funding is an issue, personnel is an issue. They have very large numbers of students attending them, and universities are huge infrastructure because of how much university sport and the NCAA goes into it. So they're like cities, rather
yeah.
than campuses. And we have things called university towns in the United States where like there probably would not be a city of the same size or magnitude or growth if there wasn't a university in it. But nonetheless, they don't have the ability or the willingness to matriculate students with that level of credit transfer on a nuanced level. So if you don't see in a perfect agreement, if it's not in the handbook, you're shit out of luck and you got to take the course again. So anyway, all that is to say, I ultimately ended up needing to do a master's of philosophy, doing that 1-year thesis, and I wanted to. And I was able to afford it because I was in the U.S. Air Force, so I had money from the U.S. government to support my doing a second master's degree. And that was what first brought me to New Zealand, as I did a 1-year master's of philosophy, just getting straight in and doing my master's research, a 120 point, and again, that's another thing, a distinction, 120 point thesis. So in New Zealand, and the systems are a little different everywhere. So some people do semesters, some people do points, some people do credit hours, some people just do credits, and the scaling of what counts is different. In New Zealand,
Yep.
a full year of coursework is considered 120 points, right? So if you say I have a 120 point thesis, that means I'm spending a year working on a thesis, right? And that's the size that you would scale it to. A PhD is 360 points. So it's the equivalent of doing 3 years worth of research. You typically don't do it in 3 years. It's like 2.5 to 4. It just totally depends. And the first year, you're not actually doing research, just mostly your proposal and literature review. But nonetheless, that's to give you an idea of the scope of a master's, the largest master's versus a PhD. There are masters or honors dissertations that are anywhere between, like, typically maybe the smallest end would be 45 points and the largest is 120. And depending upon the PhD program, any of those can get you into a PhD. But typically the longer the thesis and the more number of points, the better prepared you will be for a PhD. For example, we have a 60 or a 90 point option in the current master's degree in sport, exercise, and health at AUT. So we also have an MPhil at AUT. As you know, I did it. So you can do the 60 point dissertation option or the 90 point thesis option. Both will get you into the PhD. But because of the timeline and the need and the necessity to get ethics if you want to do human research, most of the 60 point thesis students are using previously collected data, or they're doing a literature review, or they're doing a survey, which goes through our minimal risk pathway through the AUT Ethics Committee, so they can get that approved on time. Now, certainly for certain types of PhD projects, that can be a good skill building foundation. But if you want to do actual data collection, resistance training studies, nutrition research, anything where you're actually working in the lab or in the field with lab equipment with humans, you probably want to choose the 90 point option. It gets to extend in the better part of a year, and you have the time to submit an ethics approval, and you can actually collect data on people, and you'll be better prepared for something like a PhD. I mean, you can imagine 90 points is a quarter of what you'll do in a PhD, and 60 is, like a sixth. I felt well prepared doing an MPhil because I did 120 points, a full year of research.
And I wanna give you a question that I had prepared before, honestly, about that. What are the main academic and practical requirements for entering in a PhD abroad? There is, I think, a minimum amount of these points, but if you have a larger amount, you have more possibilities. How does it work?
It's very dependent upon where you're going. So I can tell you exactly what you need to get into AUT, but it is different in other places. So let's say, for example, that you wanted to do a PhD in the US. It's very dependent upon the school. You would not only need to have a certain GPA equivalent in your bachelor's and master's to get into the PhD, but you would also have to take standardized tests and score a certain amount, typically called the GRE, the graduate, I think, requirement exam. I'm forgetting what it is. So when I was looking for a PhD program, I took the GRE because I was applying to US schools, and overseas they didn't care about it. That's not a thing in the UK, Australia, New Zealand. They are just going to look at, do you have a certain score on typically the IELTS, which is an assessment of your English language if you're going to be doing it in an English language speaking school. Or if you've completed a degree in English, in an English language country, that can be the equivalent. So for example, if let's say you did your bachelor's degree in China, and then you came to the US, you did a master's degree, that would be able to get you straight in because you've demonstrated English language competency. If you haven't done that, then you have to score at least, I think, a 7 on the IELTS. And now okay, cool. And then additionally, you have to have a certain GPA requirement and a certain size of thesis. And that needs to be equivalent at AUT, I believe, to at least a 45 point, which gets assessed. So like, for example, when a PhD student comes to me, the first thing I do is I ask them to send me unofficial transcripts and all these details, IELTS scores if they have it, and I just forward that on, or their email on, to the graduate admissions team. And the postgraduate admissions teams, they assess the qualifications and they let the student know we can give you an offer of place for a PhD, or they might say, sorry, we can only offer you a Master's of Philosophy that you might have to do first. Or in some cases, you might need to do a concurrent course, a paper with the PhD if there are certain things missing, like a methods class. This sometimes happens. There's a bit of ambiguity, like if you have a small dissertation or small thesis project, which is not evaluated as the equivalent of a PhD qualifying thesis in New Zealand, but you have something. If the supervisor or the potential supervisor signs off and says, this is good, Then the graduate research school will say, okay, it's good, but we also want you to take a methods class. And you might have to be enrolled in our research methods course that we have as a part of our master's degree programs here. So sometimes you'll get some combination of those things. It's very student dependent and based upon whether or not the supervisor feels they are in a good position to
Ready.
succeed in a PhD. Exactly. So this can also be fulfilled if the student does not have a large enough thesis but has published multiple times in the area. And then they've demonstrated that they actually are able to be part of the research process. Being a first author on that really helps a lot more because then it demonstrates you've been the corresponding author, you did the majority of the work, you're, collecting data because
So we are talking about true papers in this case.
exactly. Because as you
Not
know,
classes.
and then now we're talking about published academic paper in a peer-reviewed journal. If you have a first author publication and your thesis is maybe light, or maybe you don't have a thesis, that can, with a supervisor sign off and the graduate research school going, yeah, this is equivalent to a master's degree thesis, that can get you into the program here. But that is just AUT. It really is dependent upon
Depends.
the university. Yeah, like I said, in the U.S., you're going to need to have standardized testing. And more importantly, here's a huge distinction between PhDs in the US and some other countries and, say, New Zealand. In the US, you can go to a master's degree and just pay for it. You enroll and you pay tuition. That's not a thing for a PhD. For a PhD, these are typically funded by research grants. It's much more similar to like a postdoc that you would do in other places. So when you reach out to schools in the US, the question you have is, do you have funding? And because you might meet the requirements of the program, but if there's not a spot for a PhD student and you are slotting into typically existing research rather than saying, hey, I have a cool dissertation plan, because you'll be there for 2 years taking courses, then the professor there who you'll be working under, they often have their own lab, which is also different than most universities overseas that have, it's a university lab that a lot of people work in. It's this person's lab. Like you might say, I'm going to go work with X professor at their lab because when they got hired on in a tenure track faculty position, they were given a certain amount of budget to set up a lab, and they have this reoccurring funding that they have for students, and they are also applying for external grants to fund PhD research if there's a PhD program, and there's an entire ecosystem built to support that. So they may have a limited number of spots for funded PhD students, but you can't just say, hey, I meet the requirements, I would like to enroll, and I'm going to pay my tuition. That system ends at the master's degree level in the US, but outside of the US in many countries, including New Zealand, it persists all the way through PhD. So in New Zealand, the most common things that people do is they will either do a self-funded or a scholarship-based PhD. You can get external grants and scholarships and all that good stuff just like anywhere in the world. Those through private organizations or government grants, and there's an agreement with the university. But the most common pathway through AUT and universities in New Zealand is that you will apply for an internal PhD scholarship. So we have PhD scholarships that are available to international students, and then we also have vice chancellor scholarships, which apply to residents. And they do the same thing. They cover your tuition, which is already heavily discounted because the New Zealand government subsidizes PhDs. And then it gives you a stipend. And that stipend is, at AUT at least enough to cover for international students the financial requirements that immigration has. So I tell this to students all the time who are considering AUT. While it's not easy to get into a PhD program, you need to have like a B or a B plus equivalent in your master's, a certain dissertation length, and demonstrate certain skills and abilities that we'll see as we work on the very, very initial entrance proposal. But it's far harder to actually make the transition for another country, as you know, and as I know, to here. Because you have to show a certain number of things to get a student visa. You have to have a police background check so for a U.S. student, I'll just tell you my experience. I need to have an FBI background check that shows
Really?
I'm not a criminal. Yes, because it's our equivalent of our national policing agency.
I mean, I did something similar with in Italy with our, police
Yep.
about that,
Yep.
just to be sure. I mean, to get proof that I'm not a violent person,
Exactly.
from what I remember.
Yeah. And so long as you don't have, and I mean, you can have a very minor criminal record if it's like misdemeanor, like you drunk and you trespassed in your 20s, you're probably fine. But exactly, you need to have no violent criminal record. And you also need to, like, if you're coming over with your partner, you have to show that you're in a committed relationship and they get a concurrent work visa. And you have to prove that you've lived together, paid, bills together, etc., for a certain amount of time. You have to show that you are healthy.
Yep.
So
Yeah, it's true.
you have to get a chest exam to show you don't have tuberculosis scarring, a full physical, so that you're not necessarily a burden on the public healthcare system here in New Zealand. And the most challenging part for most students is that you need to have proof that you can be financially stable while here. So that is equivalent to roughly having, like, I think 15 or 16,000 US just sitting in a bank account at the moment. It changes based upon the economy, where you're coming from, and where New Zealand is at. So that is why the AUT stipend is just set to whatever the minimum financial requirement is from New Zealand immigration. And you can show them, hey, I've got this scholarship, and then that waives that portion. So it can take about 6 months to get a student visa. And one of the other challenging factors is that you have to accept your offer of place from AUT to get a student visa. To accept your offer of place from AUT, you have to pay your initial tuition. So for a PhD, you do that annually. So that is close to 7,000 or 8,000 New Zealand. Convert that to whatever your local currency is. For a MPhil, which was challenging for me because it's not government subsidized, it's 3 to 4 times that cost. Right? We're talking over $20,000 USD, and because it's only 1 year, I had to pay that up front. So even though I had government funding from being in the military, the U.S. Air Force, the GI Bill is what it's called, they pay you by semester. So it's like a kind of like a stipend. But I couldn't get them to give me $20,000 lump sum to get my offer of place. So I had to actually get a student loan to then pay my initial, tuition to get the offer of place to get the student visa. And then I just used my GI Bill to pay back the student loan as fast as I could. Every time they gave me something, I just immediately handed it to the US government. So I didn't accrue any
Yeah.
debt, which is good because there's no interest while you're enrolled in the school. But all of these barriers are somewhat surprising if you're not used to this. And
Yeah.
from whatever country you're coming from to whatever country you're going, there's going to be
Yeah,
complexity.
it depends also on that because I had this experience, for example, with UK, because as you remember, I was also trying at certain point to get there. And I remember a similar situation about the fact that in order to get my visa there, I need from the university a student code. So I need it before the visa. So it was very difficult at the time that.
Yeah. And this has gotten better over time in New Zealand, but I ran into similar issues. So, for example, we're going to go back all the way to 2012, where cell phone contracts were more common. And as you know, you're probably going to be renting a room or a place. And the typical length of the lease is sometimes
Yep,
over a year.
yep,
And if you are a student who's not on scholarship or you're just doing a 1 year MPhil, you only have a visa that lasts a year.
yep,
So
it's true.
if the landlord, and they're well within their rights, wants to see, okay, how long does the visa give you to be in the country? And they want to do a lease that's longer than a year, but you only have a visa for a year, and you go, but no, 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 but seriously, I'm going to keep staying. I'm going to renew it. I'm going to go into a PhD afterwards. They might be well within their rights to not give you a room. And there was even more back then. Some of this is not the case anymore, but I think it's useful just to tell people so they can expect it.
Hmm.
You couldn't get certain bank accounts based upon the length of your visa. So things got a lot easier when I finished my MPhil and I was able to get the PhD scholarship, which covered me for 3 years, because then they gave me a 3 year student visa. And a
Yeah.
3-year student visa was longer than any lease. It was long enough to get a better bank account. It was long enough to get a better cell
A
phone
game changer
contract.
at the end
It
of the day.
honestly, it really was. But when I was on the MPhil, it was I had to be on all these short-term contracts with higher interest rates. I had to become quite friendly with a landlord, and it was a challenge. And I was also here with my partner, and she's on a 1-year work visa, which also has a ton of restrictions.
Yeah, to find a position and
Yes.
everything. No, no, I know, I know. But talking about I mean, funding stipends, one thing that I would like to ask you is about work, because in Italy we have a particular system about that. I don't know here if is it possible for PhD students to work part-time alongside their studies, and what are the conditions for that?
Yeah. So there is what AUT recommends. There is what AUT recommends if you have a scholarship, and there is what is technically allowed by your visa. So a student visa allows you to work, period.
Mm-hmm.
It is actually basically a work visa and a student visa, which is
Mm-hmm.
nice. So you can work as many hours as you want on a student visa based upon the immigration rules. Now, that's not necessarily advisable by AUT because you need to have time to do your PhD or your master's or your bachelor's, whatever you're here for. And that can be really hard. I tell people all the time that my MPhil was much harder than my PhD. And that is because I was working as a full time coach. I had between 35 to 44 online athletes the whole time for my MPhil. Um, I was very fortunate to be able to get a stipend, but that stipend also came with needing to do marking, grading, and some guest lecturing for some of the postgraduate courses and undergraduate courses for John. So I was grading our and teaching some the guest lectures for enhancing muscular performance, and doing guest lectures as well for my primary supervisor, Karen Zinn. She teaches
Mm-hmm.
sports nutrition. She's a professor here. Uh, I guest lectured for her nutrition courses on protein because that was the area of my master's. So I was working as a full time coach, and I was doing maybe 10 hours a week of additional work at AUT for the stipend that I got, so that we were comfortable. Because my wife had to basically restart her career at the time. She was working in animal welfare, so she was a dog trainer, and she'd had a pretty big client list, and she had to kind of restart. And it's just like being a personal trainer. You might have 20 clients, you move, you have zero, and you have to find a place to start, a place to rent, a place to, do you do it online or whatever? So our income dropped substantially. So I had to keep working full time. And it was very difficult to essentially have, even when I was super efficient, 30 hours of work per week and complete an MPhil in 1 year. And that made it incredibly challenging. So being a self-funded student is not easy. And this is someone with a stipend, and a job that I came over there with. If you come over here and then try to find work, that's even more
Yeah.
challenging because now you have to be as a foreigner getting hired in the local market. You have to, as you know, getting work is about who you know, not necessarily
Mm-hmm.
what you know in all cases. So I was lucky, I would say, that I had a thriving online business.
Yeah.
Um, but it did make the MPhil very hard. So uh, that was my first year experience. And I was very fortunate when I was able to apply and get my PhD scholarship because I stopped taking on new online clients. And at the start of my PhD, I had around 30 to 40 clients. And by the end, I only had 10 because I just closed the doors and I only worked with the people I had. So my PhD was,
Very similar to my experience.
yeah, my PhD was getting progressively easier because I could spend more and more time on it. Um, and my wife was able to get, more full time work. She started working as a zookeeper, so because she needed time to actually build a profile, and once she got a 3-year work visa, that made things easier for her. So as she got work, and I was able to downgrade my work and replace it with scholarship income, all of a sudden I had more time. And then that time, this is a personal aside, enabled me to write my books and then have more passive income and further allowing me to reduce my coaching. But the the challenge of a PhD or a master's during the thesis phase, it's very like you kind of always need to be working on it. And if you balance that with work, it's like something has to go, whether it's your sleep, your own personal training if you're an athlete, or the quality of your work or the quality of your research.
Fortunately, free time, for example, I know it's not something fair to say maybe, but during a PhD pathway, I mean, it's normal that you have maybe, you know, to sacrifice some free time just for that period is very
Yeah,
important. I mean,
it is. So during I I mean one thing people may or may not know about me is that I compete in physique sport. And I competed in 2007, 2009, 2011, and I didn't compete again until 2019. So one of the first things I decided was I simply don't have, let alone the time, but more so the ability to be
focus,
slightly
yeah.
stressed and focused by a diet that takes you down to minimal body fat levels. I did keep competing in powerlifting, and I started competing in Olympic weightlifting. But there were times during my PhD and my master's where I was used to training 8 to 10 hours a week, and I had to go down to training a total of 3 hours a week. I just had to put it on maintenance. I never stopped training. That's just not an option in my brain. But I did write programs that allowed me to be as time efficient as possible and be very highly focused. And I basically had no time outside of training, basic hygiene, eating, and staying healthy, and
Yeah.
study and work. And I had maybe the thing that I did get eventually good at, because I had, my wife had a hard conversation with me, was I set aside some time on the weekends. So I would only work maybe 4 hours on Saturday,
Hmm.
Sunday, and then my
Yeah.
wife and I would have some time to actually do and see things in New Zealand. We'd sometimes schedule in advance. This weekend is no work. But there are sometimes you just can't do that. Like if you're actually running a study, it is what it is. During my main PhD study, I lived out of a hotel in Florida. I did a multi-site. It wasn't multi-site, but I collected data at multiple places. I did data collection in the U.S., and then I also, with my tertiary supervisor, Dr. Mike Zerdos, in his lab in Boca Raton, Florida Atlantic University. They do great work there. They were generous enough to allow me to basically be a visiting researcher. So for 10 weeks, I lived out of a hotel room, had a rental car, and I was in the lab every day for 10 hours. And that's just that. So, like, I trained in the lab, I ate on campus, and I drove to and from my hotel room. And that's all I did. I didn't see my wife for except for one week. She came out for her birthday, and I snuck away from the lab and I took her to Disney World. And I still get shit for that today, that I wasn't just purely working for the whole 10 weeks that I was there, that it was 9.5 weeks. So that during that period, I was in the lab so much that I actually developed elbow tendonitis from loading plates, because
Oh,
we had 5 squat racks, combo racks. So they were bench press squat racks. And the study was people coming in 3 times per week and doing 3 sets of squat, 3 sets of bench press, and then 1 RM testing and ultrasound at the pre and post. And we had 21 total participants complete the study, and I think 24 or 25 start. And they could come in as early as 5:15 a.m. and they could finish as late as 7 p.m. So I was there almost the entire time for every single participant, except for a few mandated, like you need to take a break because you're making errors and burning out. But we needed to, yeah. I mean, we needed to have it was a room full of participants as well as research assistants. Every rack, all 5, had a stopwatch hanging on it. We had to have at least one spotter per participant and someone asking rating of perceived exertion, and at pre and post testing, tracking bar velocity. So we had a gym aware, a tendo, and those would float around. We had multiple clipboards, and we had whiteboards written with all the loads and the sets and reps that we would then manually record and then upload online. We were playing music for the same type at the same time to replicate conditions.
oh,
For each of the different people were coming in that need to train at the same time. They had to train on non-consecutive days, and they could only miss 2 training sessions to still complete 90% of all the training. So we had a whole management system. I had a Google Calendar with 5 different racks, scheduled. So during
very
that period,
intense, huh?
yeah,
That
exactly.
period.
Every day basically felt like I was spotting and loading for a powerlifting meet. And if you do that for 10 weeks straight, and you try to train yourself, you get to the point where something gives. And for me, I had such severe elbow tendonitis I couldn't straighten my right arm. Um, and this was also before I finally dealt with my hip injury that I had. I needed to eventually get surgery, so I couldn't squat, nor could I bench, and I was a power lifter. So it got to the point where the only exercises I could do, Riccardo, I could do lateral raises, calf raises, and good morning, and nothing else. And dumbbell flies, actually. I could do dumbbell flies.
Still bodybuilder, I mean,
A
little bit.
little bit. Yeah, like I think I could do sissy squats as well. So I managed to keep most of my muscle, but I had to take 6 weeks off pressing arm
Yeah,
work.
yeah, no, totally. I
Yeah.
mean, makes totally sense. No, I have a similar experience about reducing my training during the first year of the PhD because, was something totally different from before because I started my PhD 1 year later, my last master's degree. So, in the previous year, I only worked. So I needed to change everything about my life. So in the first year was the period where honestly I also lost some muscles, because I shift from 5 training session a week, 2 hour at least each one, to 2.5 basically training in a week during the first year. So yeah, I totally understand. I mean the changing that you have to experience in that with a PhD, and it's something that I think that people has to have to take in mind before to get involved in a PhD. If you are keen with that, okay, you are ready for a PhD probably,
Yes.
but you
You
have to know that.
you just have to know that something has to give, and you're going to have to totally reprioritize your life. There's no way around it. And it's just something that you kind of have to embrace. I think people who are like, oh, how do I fit a PhD in and around my life? It's just not the right time to do it. You have to accept that it's going to be a fundamental and monumental change, and that's something you commit to before you start it.
You need to fit your probably life in the PhD.
Correct.
It's the opposite.
You know, and people talk about work-life balance all the time, and you still need that, but I think you just have to understand that it's within the constraints of what you're doing. Like if you are an entrepreneur and you do a new startup business, all hands are on deck. You're working on it every free moment you have. You still need to maintain mental health and physical health, or
Yeah,
everything
totally.
will fall apart. But you know that for this first couple years, maybe 5 years even, that is your life. And if you know that and you go into it, the balance is within those constraints, and it's heavily weighted towards the startup. And then eventually you're able to hire people, you back off, you get a team, you get a CEO, etc. And then it becomes something that has actual work-life balance.
Hmm.
And the same thing is
But
true of an academic career.
yeah,
Undergrad students during exams, it's not going to look that balanced. Master students and PhD students, for that length of time, which might be 5 to 7 years, you know that things are going to be heavily dominated by school because that's just what you have to do. But the goal is to then be able to find, balance afterwards.
hmm, no, no, totally. You mentioned now 5 years because was one of the questions that I had. So I mean, the typical PhD lasts. I mean, how long does a typical PhD last in your system in New Zealand, but also in US, since you know how
Yeah.
it works?
Yeah. So in New Zealand, Australia, UK, it's typically 3 to 4 years
Mm-hmm.
because there's not coursework. So you come in and you typically are getting your big proposal done in the first year. That's the big milestone. You do an oral presentation, you have internal review, and the goal is it's similar to a defense, but the goal is not to defend your proposal, it's to have oversight and to make sure that the logistics, the funding, the plan, and the research question will be answered by what you've planned to do. It's typically accompanied by a very expansive document. And the traditional PhD model, you're actually having a thesis that has a certain number of chapters. You have an introduction, you have a literature review, you have a methods, you have results, and you have a discussion and maybe a conclusion. That's your traditional kind of 5-chapter PhD. In the States, while you're doing your coursework, the first couple chapters are built into that. A well-designed PhD program, this is common, but not always the way it's done. You will write your literature review as well as your methods chapter as a part of the courses that you are taking. You might have a class that's taught, and it might be your advisor or someone on your committee, or at least who's associated with it, who is instructing you on how to write a literature review. And the thing that you do to finish that class is have a literature review that will go into your dissertation. And then the methods class is also the thing you will do. It'll be your methods chapter, right? So your introduction, literature review, and methods are a part of the proposal, which you then will go, okay, cool, I'm going to present my methods, and I'm going to say what I'm going to do in front of my committee. My committee will approve it and say, okay, you are ready to go on to the dissertation phase, and your PhD proposal is passed, and that means your committee thinks you're ready to go collect research, and that's what you do for the rest of your PhD. So for that reason, in the States, 5 years is kind of the average, but you could, a really motivated student might get it done a year early. You hit a bunch of snags, it could be as long as 7 years, and there are cases where it takes even far longer. Another really important distinction between the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and US and Canada is the difference between having supervisors and a committee. And this is critical. So in the US, you have a committee, and your committee act as your supervisors, but they also act as your PhD examiners and your proposal reviewers.
Yeah.
So that means it is a different relationship than what you have with supervisors typically. The committee, you'd have your committee chair, and they do the lion's share of the work, similar to a primary supervisor, but typically even more. You are in their lab, you're working for them. It's kind of the way it's often described. Do I think it should be that way? It's another conversation, but that's how it is. And they are the ones who get to decide whether or not your proposal passes, whether you're ready to collect research, whether your research is good enough, and whether or not you will graduate, and whether or not your dissertation will be accepted. So it is a challenging thing to get the mentorship and guidance you need from them, while also demonstrating to them that you are capable. So it can be challenging for a PhD student to know when is it okay to ask for help versus I don't want to expose my ignorance to my committee because they're the person who decides whether or not I'm competent enough, I'm good enough to get my PhD. The supervisory relationship outside of North America is different. We are not the ones who review the proposal to decide if it's good to go. We do that internally, and then we submit it to the reviewers, and the reviewers decide and give another level of oversight to what we think, right? And that occurs completely within the committee. Now, the committee can be large in the U.S. You might have your chair and then 4 or 5 people, but if they're not that involved, then it's kind of sometimes just the chair. Ideally, the way it's supposed to work is you have your chair, they do the most of the work with you, you get the proposal ready, and they go, okay, I think this is good, and then the rest of the committee acts as oversight, and they go, actually, what about X, Y, and Z? But they should have been informed during that process. But often they're just kind of seeing the final product. So you may have to go back to the drawing board for another few months and adjust things, which can expand your timeline, because then you're not even starting your research yet. For the New Zealand, Australia, UK system, where it's most common.
Also Canada?
Canada depends on the university. Sometimes it can be more like the US, sometimes it can be more like Europe.
So in general, I think US is pretty different.
Yes.
From the other countries.
It is. Although the amount of power and the amount of and who decides whether or not you can graduate or pass your PhD, even in supervisory systems, that can be different. So that is university-based, that is country-based. At AUT and in New Zealand, the supervisors are very much meant to be mentors to the student who are helping them get to the point where they are their colleagues. We have systems in place so that the student is not held, can't be held back by the supervisors. So, for example, while there's forms and consultation that has to happen, and it's not normal, a student can submit their proposal without supervisory approval. I don't recommend it. You shouldn't. It's a bad idea, but you can. You can also submit your thesis without necessarily having a supervisor proposal. Again, the graduate research school is going to get involved. It's not a simple process, and it's highly not recommended, but that's in place as well. You can also submit work to change your supervisory team and say, listen, this is not working. I need a different supervisor. Our relationship's not solid, or for whatever reason, this is not working. That's very hard to do. And even if it's technically possible on paper in the US, the power imbalance and sometimes the potential fallout that can happen is definitely not in favor of the student in the US. So it's so important if you go to a school, any school, but especially in the US, that you make sure you're going into a good environment and that you have found a committee chair who will be a good mentor and is your corner and is excited and wants to help you, and they see it as important to mentor their students, not just have you come work for their lab and be the equivalent of a cheap postdoc. Yeah. So some people look to where's the best school to go and who's the most prolific researcher. Those are tertiary concerns at best. The primary thing you want to look for is who is someone I trust, get along with, and I know will mentor me and is looking out for the welfare of my future career. And that is the primary thing you want to look at. And then the second way you evaluate that is you try to speak to students who are currently in that program or have graduated from it, and you ask them what the environment is like. The people who go into PhD programs based upon the prestige of the advisor without assessing what the environment is like or whether they will be a good mentor are sometimes in for a world of hurt and don't necessarily graduate. Yeah. So anyway, it can take 5 years or longer in the US for those reasons, primarily just because you got 2 years of courses. And in Australia and New Zealand, it typically takes 3 to 4 years because you're starting at the point of doing your proposal. And importantly, your supervisors...
So without courses, correct?
Correct. No courses, 3 to 4 years. And
no papers. No
papers. Correct. No papers, no courses, official. No classes. Yeah. Yeah.
But so from what I saw here, so you start your PhD, but with a sort of project. You have a project before getting involved, I think. But after that, you have, 1 year or less to do your PGR9, if I remember correct the name. That is your final proposal. Project. Yeah, proposal.
Yeah, I think let's not use PGR9 because that's a very specific form number at AUT.
Yeah.
But in all universities in New Zealand, and typically all universities generally, it's called the PhD proposal. Or something equivalent to that. And that is when you are proposing what you're going to do for your research. And at that point in the US, you will have ideally your literature review and your methods done. Methods might get adjusted because you're literally saying what you're going to do. But in New Zealand, it is typically, especially at AUT, it's roughly a 10,000 word document on average, and it outlines every planned chapter you're going to do, with the full complement of explanation of the methods from stats to design to research questions to the actual flow. Some elements of it may be left undecided based upon the previous research that you do earlier in your PhD. And another important distinction is that and this isn't necessarily geographically different, it is university different and field specific. You may do your traditional 5-chapter PhD, or you potentially might do something called thesis by publication, or some hybrid version of that, where there's a certain number of publications required, as you know, to graduate. The way it works at AUT, we have what's called a Pathway 1 thesis or a Pathway 2 thesis, which are the ones that are used in our field of sports science. Pathway 1 is traditional. You get your 5 chapters. But Pathway 2, you could have anywhere from 6 to 10 chapters in a PhD. And that's because every chapter, besides your introduction and your conclusion, and maybe your literature review, depending upon if it's publishable or not, is going to be in the format of a peer-reviewed, published article to the format of that journal. So you'll have a little preamble that says, this has been submitted or has been accepted or is in peer review, whatever phase it's at when you go for examination and you finish your PhD, to the journal of blank. And, it fits into the thesis in this way. But then you have basically you remove the abstract, but everything else is exactly the same as the current version at whatever stage of publication it's in within your thesis. So, as an example, my PhD had 8 chapters. It had 2 literature reviews, and then it had 3 acute studies, and then it had 1 longitudinal studies, and then an introduction and conclusion. So I published chapters 2 through 7, and chapters 1 and 8 were just an introduction and a conclusion, or like the conclusion was like practical applications in future research. That's really common at AUT, specifically in sprints, but there's lots of schools at AUT, and there's lots of universities in New Zealand where they don't use a Pathway 2 format, but it is more common in New Zealand, Australia, as well as the UK, and less common, but still exists in the States. And sometimes it's somewhere in between. Like you might have a slightly different version for your thesis versus what you submit, but it's still not a traditional 5-chapter PhD. So that is also a unique distinction between different places where you might do your PhD.
Yeah. But so another thing that is related to this this structure is because there is some confusion about only the terms, I think. So a PhD student is theoretically the person that never submitted his never before, submitted his proposal, correct?
Yes.
And after that, he can become, or she can become a PhD candidate, correct?
Yes. So another thing you can call the proposal is the confirmation of candidature, right? So if you successfully pass your PhD proposal, at the end you go, hey, you've successfully passed your proposal, and now we can confirm your candidature. So if someone says I'm a PhD student, that means they are not fully in the PhD program. And there are stipulations at AUT and most universities that if you don't get confirmed candidature, if you don't pass your PhD proposal within some reasonable time frame, that you won't be able to finish the PhD. Your enrollment will be concluded. So you are a PhD student until your candidature is confirmed. And then technically at that point, if you want to put after your name, you can put PhD and then small parentheses C,
Yeah, I started to do that, but here, because I didn't know about that before, but yes, I started.
So what that states is that you are in the process of collecting data, and your thesis/dissertation, depending upon if you're overseas or in the US, has been approved, and you are good to go. And then you're expected at this point to be working on your research, in consultation, of course, with your committee or supervisors. And then once you are able to get all of that together and you meet the requirements, whether that's publishing 1 or 2 papers or just submitting 1 or 2 papers, and then you get your thesis or dissertation together and you submit it until you actually defend, you're a PhD candidate. So that is the big main milestone. It's a bigger milestone in the US because it means you've done 2 years of courses and you have had your PhD candidature approved. Your committee said, listen, yep, you're good to go. Go do your dissertation. And then you'll graduate when you finish your dissertation, but your courses are all done. And they often call that ABD, all but dissertation. So, students who are kind of just in the nebulous phase of I'll be done whenever I finish collecting research, they say, oh, I'm ABD. And that's a big deal. If you get to that point in the US, you have a much higher probability of finishing your PhD. But it also is this phase where there's less structure. There's far more hours in the lab, and you are kind of feel like you're on your own, and you're just checking in with your committee to be like, yeah, I've got 85, percent of this study done, and then I got to start next semester, blah, blah, blah. And you're teaching in between semesters, or teaching in the semesters and recovering and collecting data between them, et cetera, et cetera. So that is a different experience. In New Zealand, Australia, UK, you come in and you kind of have this nebulous first year where you just feel like you're reading a whole lot and writing a whole lot and trying to get your feet underneath you because you're working on that proposal document. You're working on your confirmation of candidature. So you're not collecting data yet, and there's no classes. So what it really feels like is I've got a year to decide what the heck I'm going to do for my whole PhD, and it needs to be solid, defensible, and you're an early PhD student, so you don't necessarily know how to create the structure of doing something like that. I found this to be a challenging phase for me, even though I did my MPhil and my PhD at AUT, because to get into the MPhil or to even start your master's thesis or dissertation, you write a proposal. So like the entrance document for the MPhil at AUT is your proposal. So as soon as I arrived, I was basically confirmed candidature of a master's, right? As soon as I stepped foot in the country, it was, let's get it done. I was writing my ethics approval before I was even accepted as a student for my MPhil. I wrote my 5,000 word smaller candidature statement and documentation to go to reviewers to get into the master's. And that's quite different than the PhD, where you set foot in the country, you get your apartment set up, you get a car, cell phone, all this stuff, and then while you're doing all that and trying to pay the bills, you need to be working on this massive proposal. To get into the PhD, you have to do all the stuff we talked about, and then there's also this very brief statement. We're talking 1,000 words cap, and it's typically the max. At AUT, it's a mini proposal, if you will, but it's like an entrance proposal. And you basically have to demonstrate a very rough outline of what your research question and plan is. And you'll work with your supervisors on it, but they're not quite yet your official supervisors, because you have to submit this to get into the program. So they're your preliminary supervisors while you're doing your visa application, getting your offer of place, getting your affairs in order so you can move from whatever country you're in to New Zealand if you're a foreign student. And you're working on this 1,000-word document and having meetings with your future supervisors who are trying to make sure that you have a solid plan once you get here. But then once you get here, that mild outline that just needs to be enough for the graduate admissions to go, yep, this seems like a sufficiently reasonable plan to a non-expert to get you into the program, so long as you meet all the other requirements. Then that 1,000-word thing becomes a 10,000-word thing with detailed explanations of like the statistical model you're going to use on your third study.
Yep.
And that's why it takes a full year.
But I think that also this part is, for sure here at least, is a very good thing that you can, you can have this exchange with your future supervisor.
Yes.
Maybe you don't know if he will be a supervisor or no, but it's not granted that someone, I think about in general university around the world, someone will spend time with you, a possible PhD student will spend time with you for your proposal to help you maybe to get there. It's a good thing totally, but it's particular maybe. I mean, in my opinion.
I'll tell you my philosophy and how I think it should be done. Yep. And this is from the perspective of someone who moved his whole life across the world to do an MPhil and then a PhD. I have a lot of gratitude towards the people who helped me get to where I am. Because, like you said, I didn't have a guarantee that I would necessarily be able to make all the finances work, sell, like we rented out our home. We sold 2 vehicles. We had to move our 2 cats to a rabies-free country and be able to afford that and do pet transport. Barb had to restart a career. I had to work out with my partners at 3DMJ, how is it going to work with me moving overseas? And this is a big deal. And before I had even paid my enrollment and been officially in the program, I was in contact with my supervisors, and they helped me write a 5,000-word proposal. And if something had gone wrong, I wouldn't have been enrolled, and all that work that they would have done would have resulted in nothing, So
Yep.
the philosophy I take is that I say, listen, if someone is committed to trying to move their whole life and do a PhD or a master's of philosophy or a master's or whatever, then I'm going to invest in them. And if it doesn't work out, that's all good. I see it as it's you know what? We don't worry about whether it happens or not, because some of that is going to be just luck, and just I had a lot of students who got stuck because of COVID, or who got here and then COVID immediately hit. So it reinforced this philosophy that I had just from how hard it is, even when there's not a global pandemic, to move across the world and make it work financially, emotionally, and logistically to start a PhD. So when you're a supervisor, a potential supervisor of a future PhD or master's student, if they're willing to put in the work, I think you need to treat them like they're going to be your student. And you need to have no resentment and no obligation or expectation that they do come out, because you're asking so much of them. It can affect their relationship with their family, their life, and their mental health, and their career to move overseas and do a PhD. So when someone has committed to doing it, I commit to helping them do it, regardless of what the eventual outcome is. And I have had many students who I've worked through the entirety of most of their initial proposal, as well as working on their eventual ethics and their full proposal, where they didn't actually come out. And I hold no resentment, no ill will, and it's fine. And I try to make that extremely clear, because if the other option, and then some supervisors or future supervisors do this, is they give minimal help because, listen here, there's no guarantee you're going to be my student. In many cases, that almost guarantees that they will not be your student. And it sets them up for failure, because they do get out here and now you start helping them, but they are in a position where now the clock has started. They've got 3 years before they have to start paying additional tuition, and you've extended their timeline because you were guarding your time. And I understand it. My time is valuable, but I think if you've been through it firsthand, how hard it is to move country and do a PhD, and especially an MPhil in my case, then you see that the only way it's going to work is with the support of others. So as a supervisor, I think it's your duty to not take on a student if you are not willing to just assume that it's going to go well and give them your full support. And I think that does require you to be discerning on the front end. So when someone initially reaches out to me and says, "Hey, Eric, I'm interested in doing a PhD at AUT," if there's some immediate red flags or things that I don't think is going to work, or they have misunderstandings, I'll send an email. But if they're open to coming here and physically moving, and they're probably a candidate based upon my initial understanding that could make it into the program, I will say, let's jump on a video call. And we will do that, and I will explain to them everything that we're talking about. It'll be an hour of me doing a lot of talking and them asking questions, because they need to understand the whole process and what the commitment's like. The fact that Auckland is one of the most expensive cities in the world, that the job market is not that good, and that if they don't have a way to fund themselves, or if they don't have a very high GPA, because it's very competitive to get the PhD scholarships, that it's going to be really hard. And that it's going to be a 6-month period before they get a student visa, an offer of place. They have to pay the full tuition, and they have to get a background check, a physical, and they have to just have $10,000 to $15,000 sitting in an account, and a return ticket to go back if things don't work out. And they have to have money for all of that. So I make sure to sit down and talk to them about that. And especially if they're from the US, I need them to understand that I'm not going to be their committee boss. They're not going to come work for me. It's not my lab. It's a different environment. That I'm much more like a seasoned navigator, and they're the captain of the ship. It's going to be, self-study, and I'm here to help them. But they're going to have to be very much willing to be a self-directed learner, and I will provide all the resources and support I can. So that conversation is so critically important, and the supervisor is probably going to have to give someone 6 months of time acting as though they are a supervisor before the student is actually even enrolled.
Yeah.
Or they will show up with a half-cocked initial proposal, and they're going to waste the first 6 months of their time, and then they're going to have a rush to the finish to have a very challenging confirmation. So, students, if they have a ambitious plan for what their PhD is, you got to work with them before they even actually fully enroll to make sure that it's feasible.
Yeah, this is clear. And another question that I had is always about PhD, but more, talking probably about what you will get at the end, probably. I mean, I want to talk a very little bit about publication. I mean, the expectation for publication from a PhD candidate in this case, probably during his PhD. I mean, is something that is expected or maybe suggested?
This is very much dependent upon the program. I can tell you how it is at AUT, and I can tell you what I've seen in other places. Publication is the goal of like, typically if someone's doing a PhD, they're going to be in academia. Not always. There are some people, especially in the modern environment, who they want to just become a sports scientist or be a very competitive strength conditioning expert, or they're doing a clinical doctorate that has a thesis component, but they're going to be a psychotherapist or a doctor of physical therapy or something like that. And they're doing some research and they're getting exposed to that, and that's great to make sure they're an evidence-based practitioner, but they have no intention of staying in academia. In those cases, publication is less important and only important if it's required to graduate. However, if you're going into academia, it is incredibly competitive after you finish your PhD. So the more publications you have that came from your PhD, the more likely you will be able to get a job in academia after you complete your PhD. So programs which use what we describe as Pathway 2, or which is described as thesis by publication, give a competitive advantage to PhD students because there is a system there to support them actually being published authors in the midst of their PhD. And that's within your thesis. Outside of that, the reality is that the PhD experience is one of being embedded, ideally, in a culture and a community of people all doing the same thing as you. This is why I'm really not a fan of distance PhDs or people who primarily work from home and then only go into the lab every once in a while. Mm-hmm. At SPRINS, Sports Performance Research Institute New Zealand, where the vast majority of our sport and recreation master's and PhD students are, the students who get the best experience and have the most competitive advantage are the ones who get a desk and regularly come in and are at SPRINS and collect data within the SPRINS labs, because they end up being research assistants for one another, research participants for one another. You can lean across the desk and say, hey, have you ever published in this journal before? Can I see, a template? Hey, when you published your first paper and you're a corresponding author, do you need to upload a TIFF for a JPEG or a PNG? Hey, my EndNote's acting up. Can you help me with this? Or who should I talk to if I need to get my lab induction? All of those things are so much harder to do if you're not physically there and via email and if you don't know these people. One of the biggest advantages I had is that I did my MPhil at AUT and at SPRINS, and then I did my PhD there. And I just jumped to the front of the line as far as understanding all of the procedures and processes, and I was able to get my proposal done within 6 months. So I had 2.5 years to work on my research, which was relatively ambitious.
Because you had already experience from your MPhil.
Exactly.
Yeah. In this specific lab environment.
Exactly. And there's pros and cons to that. That means I didn't get exposed to new equipment. It means I didn't get exposed to new staff. I kind of had a known quantity, but it also enabled me to cultivate that on my own. I brought Dr. Zerdos on. I went and collected data out in FAU so that I could get the experience of being at another university. So the process of being involved in the PhD, you may get some publications from your PhD itself, and ideally you should, and you would want that, which is easier to do when you're doing a thesis by publication system. But also you will end up being on other papers and doing other collaborations that are coming out of your lab. This is sometimes directly facilitated in smaller labs where everyone is expected to help on everyone else's project, and the lab focuses on like 1 or 2 projects, say, per semester. So, okay, it's not my time right now, but I'm going to be an assistant, and I will get to be like 3rd or 4th author on this paper. Now, the actual requirement, if you are going through a program which has PhD by publication, it's typically 1 to 3 papers. They may need to be fully published. They may just need to be in the format and in some process. It varies wildly. At AUT in SPRINS for the PhD, our current requirements, and they have changed year to year, is that you need to have 2 chapters in some format of publication. That could be in preparation, submission, peer review, or fully accepted. But the most important distinction is just that they're each written in the format of a article in a peer-reviewed journal. And you would be surprised how much of a difference that makes, because if you do a traditional 5-chapter Pathway 1 thesis and you submit and you finish, taking a 10,000 word methodology chapter or methods chapter and a 10,000 word, like literature review that is covering everything related to your thesis that's not designed to be in a journal, and then taking, your results chapter, which is just here's what I did, and your discussion, and then somehow turning that into multiple publications. It's the last thing in the world you want to do, and it's how do I take this 60,000 word document and turn it into 3 to 4, 5 to 7,000 word documents at the end of this journey that totally burned you out. So it's very unlikely that you're going to get that many publications out of it. So the process of actually publishing along the way, so that you maybe publish your literature review as a brief review in, say, JSCR, and that you've published, let's say, a reliability study that served the purpose, or a validation study that served the purpose of your methods chapter, and you published your acute study. Like, let's say you you did a research project on the long-term effects of caffeine on hypertrophy, right? You're going to write a review on a scoping review on the effect of caffeine on hypertrophy and say, hey, we have very little research. You actually publish that. Then you're going to write let's say you want to take a novel look at hypertrophy using, let's say, a muscle group that has not been studied. So you're like, hey, we're going to actually see the reliability of cross-sectional area measured by ultrasound on the medial deltoid or something like that.
I was thinking the same.
Yeah, right. So the middle deltoid, I should say.
Yeah.
Because we're going to look at that in addition to the quadricep, right? So that would be a published chapter. And then you would do an acute study to see, okay, for hypertrophy-specific training, does caffeine help us get closer to failure or do additional volume in the short-term crossover within participant design, maybe, or something like that. Probably not within participant with caffeine. And that you publish. And then your final study is an 8-week group versus group comparison of placebo, control, or actual caffeine on hypertrophy. Now that 8-week study is going to take you 24 to 36 weeks to actually collect and finish and analyze. You might submit your thesis before you're even done with it, or it's fully analyzed. So you have published, that literature review, that scoping review, your reliability study, your short-term study, and then you're submitting your thesis and you're continuing to write up your final study, which may or may not be done by the time you defend, or some point 3 months after your thesis is examined and you've graduated. So that is what it often looks like at AUT specifically, but it can be quite different. And you will hopefully be getting other publications from being involved in other projects that are going on in your lab or in your school. And depending upon how many professors and supervisors are working there, whether there's kind of a small lab or a large lab, whether it's a person's lab, or whether it's the university's or the institute's lab that a lot of people use, it's going to dictate how involved and how directive your committee chair or your primary supervisor are, or whether you have a lot of agency to do that on your own. And that differs by country, that differs by program, discipline, and it differs by pathway, whether it's by publication or traditional. So if you want to stay in academia, you want to find a lab that is conducive to not only your own growth and exposure to good science, but also the ability to actually publish, get experience as a corresponding author, and that is going to give you the support and the learning environment for that. And the publishing environment is one that has probably a way that it should be done, and then there's a way that it is often done, which is not ideal. So, like focusing too much on output, quantity versus quality, everyone in the lab being an author, even if you're just
Publish
there for...
or perish.
Yeah. And I'm much less critical of a bunch of students being on a paper, but there's differences between what the last author means in the U.S. Versus other places.
Yep.
The senior author position is not really a thing in Australia, or like the last author, if you're in New Zealand or Australia or the UK in many cases, it's not the senior author. Doesn't indicate that that's that person's lab. And the universities there don't weight it differently. That just means you contributed the least. But if you're in the US, Canada, and some parts of Europe, that is the quote-unquote senior author position, and it's the most valuable
important.
Besides the first author. It's a close second to the first author. And it's often
In Italy,
The
for example, we
Yep.
have, if you want to become, the last level that you want to achieve in academics, so full professor, you need to have some publications with the last name.
Yep. And what that typically indicates in systems that use that designation is that this was done under your guidance. You are the project supervisor, or it's your lab that it came out of. So an example would be, and there's nothing wrong with this. It's just not necessarily the same everywhere. Like if you were to do, like if you look at all the protein synthesis research that comes out of McMaster University in Canada under Stu Phillips, you'll see Phillips as the last author. And anytime you see Phillips as the last author, you know, oh, that's a study that came out of McMaster. And then the first author, it's the person who ran the study, which is typically a postdoc or a PhD student, or maybe a master's student, if they had a publishable portion of their master's, who did most of the actual data collection, and they were the ones who wrote the first draft, and then everyone else is supposed to have contributed in certain ways. Now, at AUT, we try to make sure that we're not giving, because there's this ridiculous thing that's happened over the years. Authorship has been lauded so much, and it's so critical to academic advancement, that the quality of research has not necessarily improved, but the quantity has. And authorship has become something that is exploded. If you looked at the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and now, the aughts, teens, and now into the 2020, the number of authors per paper has continued to expand. You'd regularly see one or two or three author papers up until like the 70s. And then it became, and now it's basically, did you sneeze in the lab and did you hand that participant
Football
a
team,
Kleenex?
you can find it.
Yeah, you're on the paper. And I'm, like I said, I'm much more sympathetic to that being done for students who are building their CV because they have to operate in this environment. But what we do at AUT and what I promote and the way I use to guide whether or not I should be an author on something is I specifically use the international guidance for medical journal editors, so the ICMJE guidelines. And they have basically a position, stand, and recommendations, a set of guidelines for who qualifies as being an author. And that is something that within our faculty, we have basically we have students sign that, and we ask our supervisors to follow that, rather than using authorship as kind of like horse trading or quid
Yeah.
pro quo. So the recommendations from the ICJME are such that you should have contributed to one of a few things. Either you planned the project, which makes almost all supervisors and committee members eligible to be authors, so nothing wrong with that. Or you contributed substantially to the data collection or the analysis or the interpretation, and then you approve the final manuscript. And that you are saying, by approving it, that I am good with everything, I believe in it all, and I'm a representative who could communicate it. So if you're on a paper and you're like, oh, I don't really know what we did, or I couldn't go to a conference and speak about it, you shouldn't be an author. If you didn't, if you just provided track changes on something after it was already planned, written, collected, and that was it, and they weren't substantial rewrites, you shouldn't be an author. The reality, though, is there's a lot of places and people who they don't even know that standard exists, nor do they want to follow it. So that is something that you can run into misunderstandings and debate and conflicts over this, because being in the last position doesn't mean anything in some places and means a lot in other places. And the standard for authorship is a lot lower versus a lot higher, and it can lead to awkward conversations. So I think you need to be very aware of that, and you want to talk to your committee and your supervisor about that. You should be aware of the ICJME guidelines. You should be aware of journal guidelines, because they will typically stipulate who should be an author and who shouldn't, who should just be in the acknowledgments. And there's a lot of places that are aware of those guidelines, but they go, no, we do it this way. And you have to respect that to some degree, because you're going up for tenure or trying to get promoted to full professor, like you said, or getting a job in the first place. They might be counting where you are on the author list, how many publications you have.
Yeah.
And you have to strike a balance as doing what's appropriate, ethical, and set your students up for success while, not hamstringing their career, right? So
Yeah.
I always find that a challenge, but what my policy is that I'm extremely transparent with all my students. They come into an environment where we encourage them to get publication experience, first authorship publication experience, so that they don't have to worry about trying to find a way to be present for one 1RM test so they can, be an author. And that I encourage use of the ICJME, and I encourage them to use it and promote it going forward. And if you look at the open science framework and guidance, that's something that I think it makes science better, because poor quality data gets published when you have 30 people and everyone's just kind of not really contributing, and the expectation is whatever. And it's basically like inflation, when the economy's in a bad state and you see inflation, authorship inflation is basically what we have.
I know. I mean, luckily, lastly, this is a very huge argument about open science, but luckily I noticed, specifically in the last few years, that there are all these movement also in sports sciences. So I'm very, very, happy for that. That we are starting to understand that we have maybe a lot of literature that is not that good, but we have a way to assess that. There is a recent article about that was very interesting, that they assess basically a bunch of studies, I think roughly 300 generally in sports science, assessing, typical the p-value reports, stuff like that. And now we have systems to check the bias about these studies. So it's something that I'm very, happy that now we have finally a system away. So yeah.
I mean, as much as there are many issues with academia, there has been tremendous changes in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, just since I've gotten my PhD. I did not even know open science was a thing until I was near the end of my PhD. And most of what I've learned has been post-PhD. I wasn't mentored on this. And that's not a critique of my supervisors. It is just the state of where sports science was. So the fact that now we actually have a lot of people who have statistical knowledge, there's more discussion of open science and how to have a higher quality research. That's a good start. The main thing that needs to change, though, Riccardo, and this is a topic for another time, is that the rewards and the incentives for getting work, getting grants, and having career progression are more aligned with good science. So some universities are doing a better job at this. So for example, at AUT, research impact is the name of the game. 10 years ago, it was, if you're in a more research dominant, like an R1 school in the US, which just means primarily about research, or if you're in a major university overseas where publication is a big deal, it's just what's the number of publications, and then secondarily, how many of them are you first author or last author, and then are they in Q1 journals with high impact factors, and that's it. But now, actual research impact is you can demonstrate how much of an impact the actual studies have had. Have they changed policy, especially in applied fields like us? Are they reaching the practitioner or the target population? If you're in physical activity and nutrition, are policymakers using what you're doing? And if you can demonstrate that you're going on media appearances, that you have a social media profile, that's actually now seen as a good thing. Now, there's a complexity here. I mean, you also have the science communicators of the world who basically don't do science anymore, and they're promoting their own marketing and podcasts. So
I know.
It's a rough world.
It's hard to distinguish here.
It is,
especially for public.
Absolutely. But nonetheless, we're moving towards a model where the quantity of publications is becoming less important. If you look at, say, things like H-index and various, metrics like that, they're counting more things than just the number of publications and the impact factor of the journal, which is good.
Mm-hmm. No, this is very good. And we are we are near the end, don't worry. One thing that you mentioned, but I would like to dive into a little bit, is about after this PhD. what you can, because this is another topic that it has some confusion, I think, because for example, I think about a postdoc, but I know that it's not, you can get different positions, not only postdoc, but maybe the meaning it's similar. But honestly, I don't know all the different positions all around the world.
Yeah. Postdocs exist in some programs, they don't exist in others. And what a postdoc means generally is that you are, after your PhD, working primarily as a researcher on a temporary contract that may be externally funded, getting more training and guidance that complements your PhD. Now, what you really want out of your first role post PhD is either to get right into an academic role with an extended long-term contract. We can discuss tenure versus just a permanent contract in different parts of the world, or something that will set you up for that. What you want out of a quote-unquote postdoc is the ability to do a lot of high-quality, high-impact research and get a fair amount of publications so that you can build your CV, so then you can apply for one of these long-term academic positions if that's your goal. So like I said, you either want to jump ahead of the postdoc phase right to that if you got enough out of your PhD itself, or you want to set yourself up for that. The problem, though, is that in academia, we're seeing fewer and fewer and fewer long-term, full-time, permanent contracts and more hourly paid work for part-time lecturers or short-term contracts for essentially research assistants or associates or fellows or whatever you call it, or what they might call a postdoc. And a lot of roles where you are a postdoc, but you're expected to continually apply for grants to fund yourself. So this is common in the States. You get a postdoc role, and there is a system in place where you are applying for funding, and your postdoc role will last as long as you can fund yourself. And I have seen some very good researchers go into one of these roles where they're spending all of their time asking for money to pay to have the job, to keep asking for money to pay to have the job, to keep asking for money, and not getting enough time to actually conduct research and publish papers. And they come out of their postdoc with like maybe one study and a whole lot of grant writing experience, but their CV doesn't improve very much. And they burn out, and it's just a pain, and it's really, really, really challenging. So what you really need is, similar to a PhD, a good mentor and a good system that enables you to do a lot of research and build your academic chops and your scientific skills and demonstrate that in a CV and build high quality publications. So that is what you're looking for. And just like when you'd be applying for a PhD program, you want to talk to other people in that lab. You want to see who is going to be your mentor, because you typically kind of have a lab structure where it is quote unquote someone's lab if it's a postdoc. And they have so that professor has a lab, and you might maybe have a couple of postdocs who are funded by that professor. And you're expected to help and run the lab, and you're kind of the primary person, quote unquote, on the ground. You might teach some, but you are primarily running the lab. Then you have PhD students who are funded, and they're also teaching courses, and they're kind of the second tier running the lab. Then you have master students, then you have research assistants and volunteers, your lab techs, right? So you kind of have that hierarchical system, and it can work very well. But sometimes it does not. And you just find that you're doing a whole lot of work, and it's not really benefiting you in this mutual way that it should. Now, in places that don't have that structure, postdocs aren't really a thing. So we don't have like postdocs at sprints. We have internally funded and externally funded positions, and we have permanent contracts and temporary contracts. So that's basically it. Is it full-time? Is it part-time? Is it temporary? Is it permanent?
All the possibilities.
Exactly. So the typical kind of academic pathway at AUT is you get a lecturer contract, right? And lecturers are where you start. You typically need to have a PhD, and you're going to get assigned 1 to 3 classes. You may have a full-time contract. You may have a part-time contract. And you are also expected, and hopefully should, be acting as a supervisor and also having some own time for your own research. So there's supervision, there's your own research, and then there's your time spent teaching, and there may be administrative roles. And that is how you build your profile over time. You apply for these various administrative roles. But not everyone does that. I myself, for example, especially because I have a job outside of AUT and my own businesses, but not everyone does this necessarily. I started as a research fellow. And a research fellow gets paid a very similar amount to a lecturer, but they may not have any classes. And primarily what they're expected to do is do research and supervise. Right. Now, depending upon the model of the university of how they get their research done, you can have universities that primarily go after big grants and funding opportunities that are external. And that's much more common in things that are more directly connected to government initiatives, society, and big funding opportunities, right? So there are some of those in sports science. Like if you wanted to get involved in concussion research, treatment of traumatic brain injuries, return to play, youth athlete development, if you're integrated into, the public school system, for example, or especially physical activity, health, diabetes, things like that, then absolutely there's a ton of opportunities. If you're like me and you're a strength and physique sports scientist, or even one level up from that, just sports science more generally, interested in performance, there's not going to be large grants. So at SPRINS, the Sports Performance Research Institute in New Zealand, the vast majority of our research is funded directly through PhDs. So a PhD student, subsidized by the government, they get about $5,000 New Zealand to do their research, and we have a fully kitted out, one of the best labs in the country for sports science. And that is how we do our research. So a research fellow at AUT, at SPRINS, is basically a supervisor, primarily. Now, that's not to say I haven't done my own research. I have gotten a few grants, and I work with some external companies that support sports science research. And I do occasionally, every few years, I'll have a first author publication that is something that's not connected to one of my PhD students. And I will, pay my students in their free time to help me collect this data. But if you look at my publications, post-PhD, 80% of them are from my students' work. And they're the lead author, and I have helped them design the study. I mentor them to learn how to collect the data, and then I help them with interpretation, analysis, dissemination, and final approval. So I end up being the supervisor of a lot of research. And my 11 to 12 hour per week role at AUT, about 10 of those hours are working directly with PhD and master students who are research-based students and mentoring them and helping them do that. So I'm close to a postdoc, if you will, but I have a permanent role eventually that I was able to get. I started in this in 2017, and I was on like 2 or 3 or 1 year contracts. But eventually I said, hey, I would, let's work toward getting me a permanent role, because this is mutually beneficial. And we do have a few people who are research fellows, or eventually a senior research fellow, which I am. And you can go that pathway. Like I can actually apply for promotion from senior research fellow to associate professor. And the lecturer pathway, and this is just AUT, but there are somewhat similar equivalents. You go from lecturer to senior lecturer to associate professor. And professors, associate professor, assistant professor, whatever they're called, those ranks, they can be more dominant towards teaching or research or supervision. Typically, at least 2 of them is a main emphasis. And that may change depending upon if the school is more of a teaching school or more of a research school that you're at, and the field. So the postdoc is similar to those, but not exactly the same. If you're outside of the US, what you're looking for is a full-time, permanent contract where you're teaching a course that stays as yours, so you can update it and you don't feel like you're constantly shifting around and having to update courses, learn new material, and it can be very stressful. It might take a couple of years to build that out. Where you have the agency to do research you're interested in and work with your own PhD and master's students, and that is something that is relatively secure. In the States, that is typically what's called a tenure track position. Okay. Now, there are teaching schools and there are research schools in the U.S. So if you're interested in primarily just working with undergraduate students, teaching, and maybe master's students, but not necessarily being a researcher, you would go to a teaching school. and you look for a tenure track position, and you'd probably primarily be a teacher, and there may or may not
Yeah.
be a research component at all. You may not be a part of a department that has a PhD program. They might have a master's program. The master's program may or may not have a thesis option, right? It could be coursework only. If you go to a research school, especially a top tier one called like an R1 university, it is much more what I described earlier with that hierarchical tier-based structure, funding opportunities. You have postdocs, PhD, masters, and then your goal is to get to be the top of that pile where you have a lab. So, and those are typically what are described as tenure track positions. You have a couple of courses you teach, and your job is to run that lab, and then you are going to be able to get promotion to a tenure track position if you take on administrative roles. So that's something a little different as well. As a senior research fellow and a research fellow, especially on a non-full-time contract, I don't take on a lot of administrative roles. I have some small ones within Sprints related to our Sprints culture and personal development and continued education related to research, and running things like journal clubs, etc., and being in meetings where we're looking at the direction of research as we move forward. But if you want to get promoted to a professor, or if you want a full-time permanent contract, or if you want a tenure track position, you need to be doing things like applying to be the head of the department, or the head of postgrad, or the head of research, taking on these administrative roles in addition to taking on PhD students, in addition to publishing, in addition to teaching. So when you go and you're applying for a role that is permanent, and it's that can get you to a professor, you need to have all of that in your CV. And the same thing if you're going for a tenure track position in the U.S. You need to be able to demonstrate those things. And that typically takes, a handful of years. The average time spent before someone gets tenure, once they get a tenure track role, is like 5 years in the U.S. And you may not be able to
From the end of the PhD?
No, from getting the tenure track role. From getting the tenure track role. So again...
to get yep.
If you did an amazing job in your PhD, you might be able to go right into a tenure track job title. If you don't have the CV to support that application to get hired, you may need to be a postdoc for a couple years, build the CV, and then you apply for the tenure track role. And then from there, the average time is like 5 years. So you're going to have to make different decisions, because you might get offered at a really prestigious large university a postdoc, or you might get offered at a small rural university, maybe somewhere you don't want to live, a tenure track role right out of the gates. And you have to decide what's better for your lifestyle and your career goals. That's the U.S., because there's a ton of universities. Outside of that, it is different, and you're typically fighting over fewer jobs, and you're looking for a permanent contract. And it is harder and harder and harder if someone wants to be a pure researcher to do that. There's I am the only, I think, I'm one of the few research fellows that is funded internally, not externally, because that is the closest thing at AUT we have to a postdoc, is someone who is part of a research project, maybe has matched funding from the school, but is also being paid by an external grant that is part of a multi-year research project, and that they have to kind of figure out a way to, how do I renew my contract every so often? There's a lot of AUT staff who are in that scenario before they eventually make themselves valuable enough and are contributing in a way that they are necessary, and the school eventually goes, all right, now we're going to offer you, or we're going to create a role that you can apply for, that you will most likely get a full-time, permanent contract. So that's kind of the goal outside of the U.S. Full-time permanent contract that does all the same things, or in the U.S., it is getting that tenure track professorship pathway role. And the important thing is that you will not be able to even get to be able to apply for those if you don't have a robust CV that has teaching experience, supervision experience, and research experience. And a PhD program may or may not set you up to be competitive for that role. And if it does not, that's when you need to do a postdoc. And if you do a postdoc, you need to make sure that it is one that will actually produce that outcome, not just burn you out and give you a lot of grant writing experience, but no publications.
Yeah. I mean, it's something very probably strategic also. After the PhD, what you will choose. Obviously, it depends also on what you can find.
Yes.
Obviously, this is you need probably to to do a balance between the two things, the more, more strategic thing to do, but also what effectively you can do. So yes, totally. Yeah. So Eric, I think that we covered everything about the PhD, everything that I had in mind. So thanks so much for your time, first of all.
Absolutely.
And before we wrap up, where can people find your work or reach out to you?
Absolutely. I have a Google Scholar profile if you want to check out my publications. I also have a profile at AUT. If you search Eric Helms, AUT, you can see my profile there. And you can also, that has my AUT email. So if anyone's interested in academia or studying here, definitely drop me a line. I take anyone, like I said, anyone who's interested in potentially moving their whole lives to do a PhD out here, and this podcast didn't scare you off, then I'm absolutely willing to talk to you and help you plan if that is the right decision. And a lot of the times when I do that sit down video call with a potential PhD student, I'd say more than half the time, the conclusion is, no, this isn't a good fit. I'm going to apply somewhere else or go locally or not move, because it's a big ask. But for the 40-30% of people who do come out here, I have students regularly stay with me for the first couple months they move to New Zealand. I help them go to meet their initial landlords, and I've even helped students purchase their first car because they don't have a bank account yet, etc. So it's something that I'm very willing to facilitate, because that's what was done for me, and that's the only way it works. That isn't a super huge stress.
I can confirm it, because I remember that you took me from the airport.
And John Cronin picked me up from the airport too, way back in 2012.
See? So maybe one day it will be my turn,
That's right. Exactly. No, seriously, I think it's a huge part of this is doing academic work, doing a PhD, doing a master's. There's not a lot of glamour, and it is ultimately, and I think the mindset that one should have, it is an act of service. Because yes, you're getting to put fancy letters after your name, but the main thing you're doing is you're contributing to the collective knowledge we have in our community. And it should be, especially in an applied field, helping the people you're trying to serve. I quite literally had people donate money so that I could make the transition to actually come out. I realized how much money we would need to fly across the world with our cats, get set up, and support myself and my wife during this time period where I couldn't work quite full time. And I asked people to contribute to the research, and I told them what I was going to study for my master's, and people gave me a few $1,000s over time, and that made the difference. So I think I have always been incredibly grateful to be able to be where I'm at, and I've always see this as I have a duty, an obligation, and a desire, I generally do enjoy it, to pay it forward, give back, and serve the community.
Yeah.
That's what doing research is. Because if you look at how much work, time, and effort you have to put in versus what you get out, it doesn't, like, go into business if you're trying to be, make money or be famous or something like that. This is an opportunity to be an educator, be a leader, contribute to the research, while also maintaining humility and committing to a life of learning. So
yeah, to grow.
Exactly. So if you're not going to do it for the love, and you're not going to do it for personal growth as well as community growth, it's not a good fit for you, and it won't make sense. The values are not aligned with what you actually have to do and what you get in return.
I totally agree with you, Eric.